The aircraft door sealed shut as Dominic Taylor stood in the terminal watching his flight depart. 20 minutes later, every plane in that airline's fleet remained grounded across America. The designer handbag that had reserved his first class seat now cost Atlantic Airways $1 billion. Before we dive into this shocking story of power, prejudice, and justice, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button right now if you've ever witnessed discrimination in public places, and subscribe to join our community fighting for equality through storytelling. Ready to see how a single moment of discrimination led to an entire airline's downfall? Let's get into it. Dominic Taylor checked his watch as his town car pulled up to O'Hare International Airport. As the 38-year-old CEO of Next Gen Solutions, he typically flew private, but today was different. His Gulfstream G650 needed unexpected maintenance, and he couldn't miss tomorrow's investor meeting in San Francisco. The potential deal would expand accessibility software to millions of visually impaired users worldwide. "I've booked you on Atlantic Airways Flight 372, first class, seat 2A, his assistant Jasmine had told him that morning. "It departs at 2:30, giving you 3 hours before your dinner with the investors." Dominic nodded, adjusting his custom-tailored suit. The journey from Chicago's South Side to tech billionaire hadn't been easy. 20 years ago, he'd been coding in a studio apartment while working 2 jobs. Now, his technology helped millions with disabilities navigate the digital world. "Atlantic Airways," he muttered to himself. He hadn't flown commercial in years, but necessity demanded compromise. The driver opened his door and Dominic stepped out, grabbing his leather briefcase. "Thank you, James. I'll call when I return." As he walked through the terminal, subtle shifts in atmosphere followed him. Security lines parted slightly as travelers noticed his bespoke attire, then closed with whispers as they noticed his skin color. At the TSA checkpoint, he placed his Rolex, phone, and briefcase in the bin. "First-class boarding pass?" the agent asked with raised eyebrows, examining Dominic's ticket. "Could I see some additional ID, sir?" Dominic provided his driver's license without comment, though several white executives ahead of him had passed through with a simple ticket check. After verifying his identity, the agent waved him through, only for another agent to step forward. "Random screening, sir. Please step aside." 15 minutes and a thorough pat-down later, Dominic arrived at the gate as first-class boarding commenced. He'd experienced this pattern his entire life. Success had only changed the venues, not the prejudice. A blonde flight attendant named Brittany Coleman greeted passengers with practiced warmth. "Welcome aboard Atlantic Airways, sir. First class is to your right." Dominic nodded politely, proceeding down the jetway. His phone buzzed with text from Jasmine confirming his hotel and tomorrow's schedule. He needed this flight to remain on time. As he entered the cabin, he noticed first class was already half full despite boarding having just begun. A white woman in her 50s with highlighted blonde hair and designer clothes had spread her belongings across 2 seats, 2A and 2B. Her Louis Vuitton handbag sat squarely in his assigned seat. Dominic checked his boarding pass again. Seat 2A was definitely his. He approached with a practiced smile. "Excuse me, ma'am. I believe you have your bag in my seat." The woman, Karen Wilson, looked up from her phone with a startled expression that quickly morphed into annoyance. She gave him a dismissive once-over, taking in his appearance with poorly disguised skepticism. "There must be some mistake," she said loudly, not bothering to check her own ticket. "My husband and I always book these 2 seats together. He's just running a bit late." Dominic maintained his composure. "I understand, but my boarding pass assigns me to seat 2A for this flight." He displayed the ticket on his phone screen. Karen barely glanced at it. "Well, there's clearly been a mix-up. Why don't you check with the gate agent? I'm sure they can sort you out with a seat in another section." Her emphasis on another section carried unmistakable meaning. By now, other first-class passengers were watching the interaction. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed vaguely amused. No one intervened. Brittany, the flight attendant, approached with a plastic smile. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," Dominic replied calmly. "I'm assigned to seat 2A, but this lady has placed her bag in my seat." Brittany glanced at Karen, who gave her a knowing look. The flight attendant turned back to Dominic with a tight smile. "Let me check your boarding pass, sir." Dominic showed her the ticket on his phone. Brittany nodded but hesitated, looking back at Karen. "Mrs. Wilson is one of our platinum members," she explained quietly. "Perhaps you wouldn't mind taking another seat just for this flight. We have some available in economy that I could upgrade slightly." Dominic felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the tension of choosing between standing his ground and being labeled difficult. Throughout his life, he'd faced these moments, as a child, as a student, as an entrepreneur, as a CEO. The expectation to compromise his dignity never ended, regardless of his achievements. "I paid for this specific seat," he replied firmly, "and I'd like to sit in it." Karen's face flushed with indignation. "I don't understand why this is such an issue. My husband will be here any minute. He's a Diamond Club member, for goodness sake." The boarding line behind Dominic was growing, with passengers trying to maneuver around the standoff. A middle-aged white couple whispered to each other while stealing glances at him. "Ma'am," Dominic said to Brittany, "I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant, please." Brittany's pleasant demeanor faltered slightly. "Of course, sir. One moment." As she moved away, Karen huffed dramatically, clutching her handbag closer and adjusting her designer sunglasses. "I don't know why everyone's making such a fuss. I just don't feel comfortable rearranging all my things now that I'm settled." From across the aisle, a black woman in her 40s observed the situation with growing concern. She wore scrubs under her coat, clearly a medical professional traveling after a shift. The lead flight attendant, Michael Parker, arrived with a brisk, authoritative stride. His gaze shifted between Karen and Dominic, lingering a beat longer on Dominic. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, directing the question to neither passenger in particular. Karen immediately launched into her version. "I'm waiting for my husband, and this gentleman is insisting on taking his seat. We always sit together, and now he's making a scene." Michael turned to Dominic with a frown. "Sir, we try to accommodate our regular customers' seating preferences when possible." "I have a confirmed reservation for seat 2A, Dominic reiterated, maintaining his calm. "I'm not asking for special treatment, just the seat I paid for." Karen's voice rose dramatically. "He's being aggressive. I don't feel safe." Several passengers turned to stare. Dominic, who hadn't raised his voice or made any threatening movements, felt the familiar weight of false accusations against his character. "I'm simply requesting my assigned seat," he said, reaching for his phone. "I'm going to record this interaction." Michael's expression hardened. "Sir, we don't allow recording on board for privacy reasons. I'm going to have to ask you to put your phone away or deplane." "This is discrimination," Dominic stated firmly. "I paid for a specific seat that this woman is refusing to vacate, and instead of enforcing your own policies, you're threatening to remove me from the flight." The situation escalated quickly. Michael spoke into his radio, requesting the captain's presence. Minutes later, Captain Benjamin Walsh appeared, his uniform crisp and authoritative. "What's going on, Michael?" he asked, surveying the scene. "This passenger is disrupting the boarding process and threatening to record our staff," Michael reported promptly. "Mrs. Wilson is a long-standing Diamond member feeling uncomfortable." Captain Walsh assessed the situation with a quick glance, his eyes lingering on Karen's distressed expression and expensive attire before shifting to Dominic's stern face. "Sir, if you're causing a disturbance, I have the authority to remove you from this aircraft," the captain stated firmly. "I'm causing a disturbance by requesting the seat I paid for?" Dominic asked incredulously. The captain's jaw tightened. "I'll need to ask you to deplane immediately, or I'll call security." The black woman across the aisle stood up. "Excuse me, I'm Dr. Aisha Johnson. I've been sitting here the whole time, and this gentleman has done nothing wrong. He's simply asking for his assigned seat." Captain Walsh barely acknowledged her. "Ma'am, please stay out of this. It's a security matter now." With a nod from the captain, Michael called for security. Two officers arrived promptly, positioning themselves on either side of Dominic. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one stated firmly. Dominic looked around at the watching passengers, at Karen's barely concealed smirk, at the indifferent airline staff. With dignity, he gathered his briefcase. "This isn't over," he said quietly. As security escorted him from the plane, he caught a final glimpse of Karen placing her designer purse triumphantly on seat 2A, his seat. "Sir, you need to keep moving," the security officer instructed as they marched Dominic through the terminal. Curious onlookers stared at the unexpected spectacle of a well-dressed black man being escorted by airport security. "I have every right to be on that flight," Dominic stated firmly. "I had a confirmed first-class reservation." The security officer, whose nameplate read Thomas Reynolds, maintained a professional demeanor, but his eyes betrayed discomfort. "I'm just doing my job, sir. You'll need to take it up with the airline." Dominic felt a familiar burning sensation in his chest, the uniquely painful mix of humiliation and injustice he'd first experienced as a child when a teacher accused him of cheating because his math scores were too high for someone like him. He'd felt it in college when campus security stopped him while walking to the library, demanding identification. He'd felt it in his early career when clients assumed he was the IT support rather than the software architect. But now, as a billionaire CEO, the stakes were different. This wasn't just about him. "Where are you taking me?" Dominic asked as they proceeded through the terminal. "Customer service desk," Thomas replied quietly. "Look, sir, between us, I'm sorry about this. I've seen this kind of thing before." They arrived at the customer service area, where a young Asian woman named Lisa Chen sat behind the counter, handling a line of frustrated travelers. When she finished with the current customer, Thomas led Dominic forward. "This passenger was removed from Flight 372, Thomas explained. "He needs assistance." Lisa's expression was neutral but dismissive. "Please take a seat, sir. I'll be with you shortly." "I'll wait right here," Dominic replied firmly. Thomas departed with an apologetic glance, and Dominic stood at the counter, briefcase in hand, as Lisa deliberately attended to paperwork, avoiding eye contact. After several minutes, Dominic placed his executive platinum membership card on the counter. Lisa glanced at it, then looked up with sudden attentiveness. "Mr. Taylor, I apologize for the wait. How can I assist you today? I was just removed from Flight 372 because a woman refused to remove her handbag from my assigned seat, and rather than enforcing your seating policies, your staff decided I was the problem." Lisa's expression shifted to concern. "Let me call the gate supervisor right away." While she made the call, Dominic checked his phone. The investor meeting couldn't be rescheduled. Millions in potential funding and, more importantly, the opportunity to help countless disabled users hung in the balance. 10 minutes later, a harried-looking man in an Atlantic Airways uniform approached. His nameplate read, James Morris, Gate Supervisor. "Mr. Taylor? I understand there was some confusion with your seating arrangement," James began, his tone suggesting this was a minor inconvenience, rather than a humiliating act of discrimination. "There was no confusion," Dominic stated. "I had a confirmed reservation for seat 2A. A woman placed her handbag in my seat and refused to move it. Instead of resolving the situation appropriately, your staff removed me from the flight." James sighed as if dealing with a difficult child. "These things happen sometimes on crowded flights. I can offer you a seat on our next flight to San Francisco, which departs at 7:30, and a $200 travel voucher for your inconvenience." "The next flight would make me miss a critical business meeting," Dominic replied. "And you're characterizing racial discrimination as an inconvenience?" James's expression hardened. "Sir, race has nothing to do with this. We make seating adjustments all the time." Was the white woman with the handbag removed from her seat, or just the black passenger with a valid ticket? James crossed his arms. "Look, I'm offering you a reasonable solution. Take it or leave it. These people always want special treatment," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Dominic to hear. Dominic straightened his tie. "I'll need a moment to make some calls." As he stepped away, James turned to Lisa with an eye roll. Typical. They always try to make everything about race. Lisa's eyes suddenly widened as she looked at her computer screen, where Dominic's complete customer profile had finally loaded. "Mr. Morris," she whispered urgently, "do you know who that is?" James waved dismissively. "Just another entitled passenger. He'll take the later flight." "That's Dominic Taylor," she insisted. "The CEO of Next Gen Solutions. His company is worth billions." James froze, then scoffed. "You must be mistaken." But Lisa was already frantically typing, turning her screen to show a Forbes article featuring Dominic's photograph. James's face drained of color, but when he turned to approach Dominic, the CEO had already disappeared into the airport's exclusive United Club lounge. Once inside the quiet sanctuary of the premium lounge, Dominic found a private room and closed the door. His hands shook slightly as he dialed the first number. "Victoria," he said when his chief legal counsel answered, "I need you to drop everything. Atlantic Airways just provided a textbook case of discrimination, and I'm going to make sure it costs them. What came next would change the airline industry forever. Who among you has ever been denied something you were entitled to based on prejudice? Comment number 1 if you've ever been discriminated against or witnessed discrimination. Do you think Dominic should pursue legal action or simply take the later flight and move on? Hit that like button if you believe companies should be held accountable for discriminatory actions. And what calls do you think Dominic is about to make? Let's find out in the next part of this shocking true story. As security escorted Dominic through the crowded terminal, the stares of hundreds of travelers bore into him like physical pressure. Some averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the spectacle. Others watched with open curiosity, already forming assumptions. A few nodded in subtle solidarity, recognizing the familiar scene of a black man being removed regardless of his status or right to be there. Thomas Reynolds, the security officer, maintained a professional demeanor, but his voice dropped to a near whisper. "Just follow procedure, sir, and this will go smoother for everyone." Dominic walked with his shoulders back and head high, his father's voice echoing in his mind. "They can take your seat, son, but never let them take your dignity." His father, Harold Taylor, had built a small electronics repair shop from nothing, facing discrimination daily, yet never bowing his head. Now his son, worth billions, was experiencing the same treatment in a first-class cabin instead of a bus seat. "Where exactly are you taking me?" Dominic asked calmly. "Customer service desk," Thomas replied. "Between us, sir, I've seen this happen before. I'm just following orders, but it doesn't sit right." They arrived at the customer service area where Lisa Chen sat behind the counter, helping another frustrated traveler. She glanced at Dominic, then looked away, seeming to categorize him as a problem to deal with later. When she finally addressed him, her tone was perfunctory. "Please take a seat, sir. I'll be with you shortly." "I'll wait here," Dominic replied firmly, staying at the counter. Lisa deliberately shuffled papers, avoiding eye contact. After several minutes of this pointed neglect, Dominic placed his executive platinum card on the counter. Lisa's eyes widened slightly as she registered his status. "Mr. Taylor, I apologize for the wait. How can I assist you today?" "I was removed from Flight 372 because a woman refused to move her handbag from my assigned seat. Rather than enforcing your seating policy, your staff decided I was the problem." Lisa's demeanor shifted instantly. "Let me call the gate supervisor right away." While waiting, Dominic checked his calendar. The investor meeting represented more than money. It was about securing funding for software that would help visually impaired users navigate digital spaces more effectively. As the minutes ticked by, he calculated alternate routes to San Francisco, none of which would get him there in time. James Morris, the gate supervisor, arrived looking annoyed at being summoned. His expression suggested this was a routine customer complaint rather than a serious incident. "Mr. Taylor, I understand there was some confusion with your seating arrangement," he began condescendingly. "There was no confusion," Dominic stated firmly. "I had a confirmed reservation for seat 2A. A passenger placed her handbag in my seat and refused to move it. Instead of resolving the situation appropriately, your staff removed me from the flight." James sighed heavily. "These things happen sometimes. I can offer you a seat on our next flight to San Francisco, which departs at 7:30. and a $200 travel voucher for your inconvenience. The next flight would make me miss a critical business meeting, Dominic replied. And you're characterizing racial discrimination as an inconvenience? James's friendly facade cracked slightly. Sir, race has nothing to do with this. We make seating adjustments all the time. Was the white woman with the handbag removed from her seat? Or just the black passenger with a valid ticket? James crossed his arms defensively. Look, I'm offering you a reasonable solution. Take it or leave it. Then, under his breath but audible enough, he added, these people always want special treatment. The comment hit Dominic like a physical blow. Throughout his career, his legitimate achievements had been dismissed with similar phrases. His technology patents, diversity initiatives. His business success, government contracts for minority-owned businesses. Never mind that NextGen had revolutionized accessibility software through pure innovation. I'll need a moment to make some calls, Dominic said, stepping away from the counter. As he moved away, he heard James mutter to Lisa, typical. They always try to make everything about race. Lisa's eyes suddenly widened as she looked at her computer screen, where Dominic's complete customer profile had finally loaded. Mr. Morris, she whispered urgently, do you know who that is? James waved dismissively. Just another entitled passenger. He'll take the later flight. That's Dominic Taylor, she insisted. The CEO of NextGen Solutions. His net worth is over $3 billion. James froze momentarily, then scoffed. You must be mistaken. But Lisa was already turning her screen to show a Forbes article featuring Dominic's photograph. The color drained from James's face as recognition dawned. When he turned to approach Dominic, the CEO had already disappeared into the airport's exclusive United Club lounge. Once inside the quiet sanctuary of the lounge, Dominic found a private room and closed the door. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from controlled anger. He'd spent his life building himself into someone who couldn't be dismissed. Yet it had happened again in front of a plane full of witnesses. He took 3 deep breaths, centering himself before making the first call. Victoria, he said when his chief legal counsel answered. I need you to drop everything. Atlantic Airways just provided a textbook case of discrimination, and I'm going to make sure it costs them. Victoria Washington, a Harvard-educated attorney who had turned down Supreme Court clerkships to help Dominic build NextGen's legal department, responded immediately. Tell me everything, and don't leave out any details. As Dominic recounted the incident, Victoria took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. They've violated at least 7 different statutes, she finally said, not to mention the contract of carriage. This is actionable, Dominic. Extremely actionable. I don't want just a settlement, Dominic replied. I want change. Understood. I'm pulling the team together now. We'll need witness statements. Was anyone recording? A doctor across the aisle seemed sympathetic. She tried to speak up for me. We'll find her. In the meantime, stay where you are. I'm going to start making calls. His next call was to Anthony Richardson, a close friend who happened to be a United States Senator and chairman of the Transportation Committee. Dominic, good to hear from you. How's everything? Not good, Anthony. I just experienced blatant discrimination on Atlantic Airways, and I'm going to need your help. As Dominic explained the situation, the senator's tone grew increasingly concerned. This is exactly the kind of case we've been gathering evidence on. The pattern of discrimination in the airline industry is systemic, but we rarely get such clear-cut cases with credible witnesses. What can you do? Officially, I can contact the FAA and request an immediate investigation into their compliance with non-discrimination policies. Unofficially, I can make sure this doesn't get buried. Thank you, Anthony. No, thank you, Dominic. Your willingness to fight this battle will help countless others who don't have your resources or platform. His third call was to Jordan Ellis, NextGen's PR director. Jordan, we have a situation developing. Within minutes, Jordan had a team monitoring social media for any mentions of the incident. If anyone was recording, it'll hit Twitter first, she explained. We need to get ahead of this narrative. While Dominic was making these calls, Dr. Aisha Johnson remained on the flight, seething at what she had witnessed. As a surgeon who had faced her own battles with discrimination, she recognized the injustice immediately. When the flight attendants were distracted with the boarding process, she took out her phone and recorded a quick video describing what had happened, tagging Atlantic Airways and uploading it to her social media accounts. "I just witnessed a black man being removed from Atlantic Airways Flight 372 for simply requesting to sit in his assigned first-class seat. A white woman had placed her designer handbag in his seat and refused to move it. Instead of asking her to comply with seating assignments, the crew removed him from the flight. This is what discrimination looks like in America today, even for well-dressed black professionals. Atlantic Airways, is this your policy? Atlantic Airways, racism. Flying while black." The video began to circulate immediately. Back in the lounge, Jordan's phone pinged with an alert. "Dominic, we've got a situation. A video about the incident is going viral. A Dr. Aisha Johnson posted it." As Dominic reviewed the post, Atlantic Airways' stock price ticked downward by 0.5 point as investors reacted to the negative publicity. Inside the plane, the flight that should have departed was still at the gate, with the pilot announcing technical issues causing the delay. In reality, airline staff were scrambling to understand the growing social media firestorm. In first class, Karen Wilson was boasting to her seatmate about getting that man removed from the flight. "He clearly didn't belong here," she said, loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I mean, I've been flying first class for 20 years and I know the type of people who should be here." Brittany, the flight attendant who had first encountered Dominic, overheard this comment while helping another passenger store luggage. Her stomach tightened with the growing realization that she had participated in something deeply wrong. The cockpit. Captain Walsh received an urgent call from airline headquarters. "What do you mean, verify the incident? We removed a disruptive passenger according to protocol." Karen's husband, William Wilson, finally boarded the plane, looking harried. "Sorry I'm late, dear. The meeting ran long." Karen beamed triumphantly. "I saved your seat. Some man tried to claim it was his, but I took care of it." William frowned. "What do you mean? I thought we were in 3A and 3B on this flight." Karen's smile faltered. "No, we always sit in 2A and 2B." William pulled out his boarding pass. "Not today, Karen. Look, we're in row 3. As this realization dawned, Captain Walsh made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties that need to be resolved before departure. We appreciate your patience." The real reason for the delay was the rapidly escalating situation behind the scenes. Have you ever witnessed someone standing their ground against discrimination? Comment number 1. If you believe Dominic is doing the right thing by fighting back, would you have recorded the incident like Dr. Johnson did if you were a witness? Double tap that like button if you think more bystanders should speak up against injustice when they see it. And how do you think Atlantic Airways will respond once they realize who Dominic really is? Subscribe to find out what happens next in this incredible story of power, privilege, and justice. Inside the premium airport lounge, Dominic Taylor settled into a private meeting room, transforming it into a command center for what would become a corporate earthquake. The plush leather chair and ambient lighting belied the serious nature of the calls he was making. "Victoria, I need the full team on this," he said to his chief legal counsel, Victoria Washington. "Pull whatever resources you need." Victoria's voice was calm but determined. "I'm already drafting the initial filing. This is textbook discrimination, Dominic. They violated federal aviation regulations, civil rights statutes, their own contract of carriage, and about 5 state laws I can think of immediately." "Good. And the witness?" "We're trying to identify the doctor who spoke up for you. Social media team is scanning posts related to the flight." Dominic ended the call and immediately dialed Senator Anthony Richardson, a longtime friend and board member who chaired the powerful Transportation Committee. "Anthony, I need your help." Dominic explained the situation in precise detail. The Senator's response was immediate. "This is exactly what we've been investigating, Dominic. The pattern of discriminatory treatment in commercial aviation is extensive, but we rarely get such clear-cut cases with credible witnesses. I'll contact the FAA personally." "Thank you, Anthony. This isn't just about me." "I know. It's about everyone who doesn't have your platform or resources. I'll make some calls right now. Dominic's third call was to Jordan Ellis, his PR director. Jordan, we have a situation developing. I heard. It's already hitting social media. A passenger named Dr. Aisha Johnson posted about it. The video is gaining traction fast. Dominic pulled up the post on his phone. Dr. Johnson had recorded a detailed account of what she witnessed, complete with descriptions of the flight crew's actions and Karen's behavior. The hashtag, Cheer Atlantic Airways Racism, was trending within minutes. Perfect timing, Jordan continued. Their stock just dropped 2 points since the market opened. Investors hate this kind of publicity. Monitor the situation. I want hourly updates on social media sentiment and any official response from Atlantic. Meanwhile, Flight 372 remained at the gate, the technical difficulties becoming more concerning to passengers with each passing minute. In the cockpit, Captain Benjamin Walsh was on a call with Airline headquarters, his forehead beaded with sweat. What do you mean he's who? The captain's face paled as he listened. How was I supposed to know that? He was causing a disturbance. In first class, Karen Wilson was still congratulating herself on securing her seating arrangement when her husband William finally boarded, looking harried and checking his watch. Sorry I'm late, dear. The meeting ran long. Karen beamed triumphantly. I saved your seat. Some man tried to claim it was his, but I took care of it. William frowned as he checked his boarding pass. What do you mean? We're in 3A and 3B on this flight. Karen's smile faltered. No, we always sit in 2A and 2B. William showed her his ticket. Not today, Karen. Look, we're in row 3. Color drained from Karen's face as she fumbled for her own boarding pass. Sure enough, it read, Seat 3A. The seat she had been so vehemently defending with her designer handbag wasn't hers at all. There must be some mistake, she muttered, looking around nervously as nearby passengers began to whisper. Across the aisle, Dr. Aisha Johnson had been, updating her social media post with new developments. When she overheard Karen's conversation, she stood up and approached. Excuse me, she said, her voice steady and clear. Are you saying you had the wrong seat all along? After that black gentleman was removed from the flight for trying to sit in his assigned seat? Karen's face flushed. This is a private conversation. Please mind your own business. It became my business when I witnessed discrimination, Dr. Johnson replied. I've already documented what happened, and it's being shared widely online right now. Other first-class passengers began to murmur, the atmosphere growing tense as the realization of what had occurred spread through the cabin. Meanwhile, in the airline's corporate headquarters, Atlantic Airways stock had dropped another 3 points as Atlantic Airways racism continued trending nationwide. Robert Harrison, the CEO, called an emergency meeting with his executive team. Someone tell me exactly what happened and who this passenger is, he demanded, slamming his hand on the conference table. The VP of Customer Experience swallowed hard. The passenger removed from Flight 372 was Dominic Taylor, CEO of NextGen Solutions. The room fell silent. Everyone present recognized the name. NextGen wasn't just any company, it was a tech giant, valued at over $40 billion, known for its revolutionary accessibility software and Dominic's philanthropic work. And why exactly was he removed? Harrison asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Initial reports suggest a seating dispute with another passenger. A woman placed her bag in his assigned seat and refused to move it. When Mr. Taylor insisted on his assigned seat, the situation escalated. Harrison closed his eyes briefly. So we removed a black billionaire CEO from our flight because a white woman put her handbag in his legitimate seat and refused to move it? That appears to be the case, sir. Harrison's phone rang. The caller ID showed Senator Richardson's office. This just gets better and better, he muttered before answering. Back at the airport, Patricia Armstrong, Atlantic Airways Regional Director, was rushing toward the United Club Lounge. After being briefed on the situation, she understood the gravity of what had transpired. Atlantic Airways had discriminated against one of the most influential black executives in America, and the evidence was already spreading across social media. Mr. Taylor, she called as she entered the private room where Dominic sat reviewing documents on his tablet. "I'm Patricia Armstrong, Regional Director for Atlantic Airways. I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable treatment you received today." Dominic looked up, his expression neutral. "Ms. Armstrong, we can accommodate you on our next flight to San Francisco in our best first-class suite. Additionally, I'm authorized to offer you complimentary flights for a year and a significant compensation package for the inconvenience and distress caused." "Inconvenience and distress," Dominic repeated slowly. "Is that how your company characterizes racial discrimination?" Patricia faltered. "Sir, I assure you Atlantic Airways does not condone discrimination of any kind. This was an unfortunate isolated incident." "It wasn't isolated," Dominic interrupted. "Your flight attendant immediately sided with the white passenger. Your captain didn't verify the facts before having me removed. Your gate agent suggested I was seeking special treatment when I requested the seat I paid for. This was systematic, not isolated." Patricia's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Mr. Taylor, please. We're trying to make this right." "It's far too late for that," Dominic replied calmly. "But you're welcome to try." As Patricia struggled to formulate a response, Dominic's phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Harrison, Atlantic Airways CEO. "I should take this," Dominic said, answering the call and putting it on speaker. "Robert, this is unexpected." Harrison's voice was strained. "Dominic, I just learned about the inexcusable incident on our flight. I wanted to personally apologize and assure you this does not reflect our company values." "Interesting," Dominic replied. "Because it perfectly reflected the behavior of your employees at every level of interaction. We're conducting a full investigation. The staff involved have been placed on administrative leave pending." "That won't be necessary," Dominic interrupted. "Your employees were simply acting within the culture your company has created. By the way, did you know NextGen holds approximately 7% of your parent company's shares?" Silence hung on the line for several seconds. "I was not aware of that," Harrison finally responded. "And did you know that Senator Richardson, who chairs the Transportation Committee, has just called for an emergency hearing on discriminatory practices in the airline industry, with Atlantic Airways as the primary focus?" "We've just been notified," Harrison admitted, his voice noticeably weaker. "One more question," Dominic continued. "Were you planning to announce your partnership with Robertson Media Group next week? The 8-figure advertising deal?" "How did you—" "I sit on their board," Dominic explained. "I was going to recuse myself from those discussions, given my personal experience with Atlantic Airways, but now I don't think that will be necessary. I'll be voting my conscience." The implications hung in the air. Robertson Media Group controlled billions in advertising spending across multiple platforms. While this conversation unfolded, FAA officials had arrived at the gate of Flight 372, which still hadn't departed. Passengers watched with growing frustration and curiosity as the officials spoke with the flight crew. "We're conducting a review of potential safety violations," one official explained to the increasingly restless passengers. "We apologize for the delay." In reality, the safety violations were a pretext for grounding the flight, while the discrimination complaint was investigated, a direct result of Senator Richardson's call to the FAA administrator. Patricia Armstrong, still standing in the lounge with Dominic, received an urgent text. Her face paled as she read it. "Mr. Taylor, I've just been informed that Flight 372 has been grounded pending an FAA investigation." "Just Flight 372?" Dominic asked. Patricia's phone buzzed again. She read the message and looked up in shock. "All Atlantic Airways flights at O'Hare have been temporarily grounded." Dominic nodded thoughtfully. "The FAA takes discrimination seriously, as they should." On the still grounded plane, Captain Walsh entered the cabin to speak with Karen Wilson. "Ma'am, I need to confirm. Your assigned seat for this flight." Karen glanced nervously at her husband, who was showing the captain their boarding passes. "As you can see, we're assigned to row 3, not row 2, William explained, embarrassment evident in his voice. The captain's expression hardened. So, the passenger we removed was correctly assigned to seat 2A? There must have been some confusion, Karen said defensively. The confusion, Dr. Johnson interjected from across the aisle, was that you assumed a black man couldn't possibly belong in first class, so you refused to check your own ticket. Other passengers murmured in agreement. The incident that had seemed acceptable to many just an hour ago now appeared in a different light as the consequences began to unfold. Captain Walsh returned to the cockpit only to receive the worst news of his career. All Atlantic Airways flights nationwide were being grounded pending a comprehensive safety review. The real reason was becoming clear to everyone involved. This wasn't just about one flight or one incident. This was about to become the most expensive designer handbag in aviation history. Dominic Taylor sat in the private room of the United Club lounge, the calm eye of a storm he had methodically unleashed. His tablet displayed real-time updates of Atlantic Airways' plummeting stock price, down 12% and falling as news of the fleet-wide grounding spread. Patricia Armstrong, Atlantic Airways regional director, paced anxiously across the room. Her composed corporate demeanor had given way to visible panic as reports filtered in from across the country. Mr. Taylor, please reconsider. We can arrange immediate transportation to San Francisco on a partner airline. We'll upgrade you to their finest first-class accommodation. Additionally, we're prepared to offer a settlement of $500,000 for your inconvenience. Dominic looked up from his tablet. Ms. Armstrong, do you understand what happened today? There was an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding seating assignments. No, Dominic interrupted firmly. A passenger placed her designer handbag on my assigned seat because she didn't believe I belonged there. Your staff supported her assumption rather than your own seating policies. When I asserted my rights, I was treated as a threat and removed from the aircraft. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's textbook discrimination. Patricia's phone rang again, the fifth call in as many minutes. Excuse me, I need to take this, she said, stepping away. While she spoke in hushed, urgent tones, Dominic's phone lit up with a call from Victoria Washington, his chief legal counsel. The lawsuit is ready, Victoria reported. Discrimination, breach of contract, emotional distress, civil rights violations. We've covered everything. But there's more. We've identified 7 similar incidents with Atlantic Airways in the past year alone. All involve passengers of color being removed or reseated when white passengers complained. File it immediately, Dominic instructed, and make sure the press has access to the public documents. His next call was from Jordan Ellis, his PR director. Dominic, the story has gone national. Dr. Johnson's video has over 2 million views. Yars Atlantic Airways racism and Tosh designer bag discrimination are the top trending hashtags. We've received interview requests from every major network. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning, Dominic replied. But make it clear this isn't about me. It's about a pattern of behavior that affects thousands of travelers who don't have my resources. As he ended the call, Patricia returned, her face ashen. Mr. Taylor, I've just been informed that the Transportation Committee has called an emergency hearing on discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. They've specifically requested testimony from Atlantic Airways executives. Senator Richardson works quickly, Dominic noted with a slight smile. Patricia's phone buzzed with a text. She read it and looked up in shock. All Atlantic Airways flights nationwide have been grounded pending a comprehensive safety review. Safety review? Dominic raised an eyebrow. Interesting terminology for a discrimination investigation. At that moment, Robert Harrison, Atlantic Airways CEO, called again. Dominic answered on speaker. Dominic, this has gone too far, Harrison began, his voice strained. We're losing millions by the minute with this grounding. That sounds like a business problem, Robert. Perhaps you should have considered the financial implications of discrimination before allowing it to become standard practice. What do you want? Harrison demanded. Name your price to end this. This isn't about money, Dominic replied calmly. It's about accountability and change. By the way, did you know that NextGen is launching a major accessibility initiative with your competitor tomorrow? We had considered Atlantic as a partner, but their commitment to inclusivity was questionable. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Atlantic Airways had been pursuing a partnership with NextGen for months, seeing it as a way to improve their technological infrastructure and public image. I wasn't aware of that development, Harrison finally responded. And one more thing, Dominic continued. The Robertson Media Group board meeting has been moved up. We'll be reviewing all advertising partnerships tomorrow morning. As a board member, I feel compelled to share my personal experience with Atlantic Airways. Robertson Media Group controlled billions in advertising spending across multiple platforms. Losing their business would be devastating for Atlantic. Dominic, please. Harrison's voice had lost all pretense of corporate authority. We can work this out. I agree. Here's how. First, you will implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all staff, developed in consultation with civil rights experts. Second, you will create clear protocols for resolving seating disputes that don't default to removing passengers of color. Third, you will establish a significant fund to support organizations fighting discrimination. Fourth, you will diversify your board and executive team to better reflect the customers you serve. That's extensive, Harrison hedged. I'm not finished, Dominic continued. Fifth, the employees who participated in my removal will undergo specialized training rather than being terminated as scapegoats for a systemic problem. And finally, you will issue a public statement acknowledging this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that requires structural change. You can't dictate how we run our company, Harrison protested weakly. I'm not. I'm giving you the opportunity to save it, Dominic replied. The alternative is continuing on your current path, which includes a fleet-wide grounding, a high-profile discrimination lawsuit, a congressional hearing, lost advertising revenue, and a partnership with your largest competitor. Your stock has dropped 15% in the last hour. How much more can you afford to lose? The question hung in the air unanswered. Meanwhile, on the still grounded Flight 372, chaos had erupted. The captain had announced that all Atlantic Airways flights nationwide were grounded, with no estimated time of departure. Passengers were furious, many of them connecting on social media to discover the reason behind the unprecedented grounding. Karen Wilson had become the focus of growing hostility as word spread about her role in the incident. Passengers who had witnessed the removal of Dominic Taylor were now openly discussing what they had seen, with many expressing regret at their silence. You got that man thrown off for nothing, one passenger said directly to Karen. And now, we're all stuck here because of it. Karen's husband William looked mortified. Karen, did you really put your bag in someone else's assigned seat? I thought it was our seat, she insisted, though her confidence had evaporated. How was I supposed to know he was some important CEO? It shouldn't matter who he was, Dr. Aisha Johnson interjected from across the aisle. Every passenger deserves respect in their assigned seat. The fact that you think it's worse because he turned out to be wealthy and powerful just highlights the problem. Several passengers nodded in agreement, the mood in the cabin shifting dramatically as the full implications of the situation became clear. FAA officials boarded the plane and approached Captain Walsh. Sir, we need to speak with you regarding potential violations of federal aviation regulations. As the captain was escorted off the aircraft, Brittany Coleman, the flight attendant who had first suggested Dominic take a seat in economy, watched with growing anxiety. She had followed what she thought was standard practice, prioritizing the comfort of a wealthy-looking white passenger over the rights of a black passenger, regardless of his ticket. Now that unwritten policy was being exposed on a national stage. Back in the lounge, Dominic received updates from his team about the widening impact of his actions. Atlantic Airways' operational meltdown was costing them an estimated $15 million per hour. Their stock had dropped 18%, erasing over $1 billion in market value. Patricia Armstrong received yet another urgent call and stepped away to take it. When she returned, her professional facade had completely crumbled. Mr. Taylor, she began, her voice unsteady. I've just been informed that Atlantic Airways Board of Directors has called an emergency meeting. They're discussing leadership changes. Dominic nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a prudent business decision. Patricia hesitated before continuing. I've also been authorized to inform you that the board is prepared to accept all of your conditions. They're requesting that you help bring an end to the grounding as a show of good faith. The grounding is an FAA matter, Dominic replied. I'm just a passenger who was denied his rightful seat. But if Atlantic Airways issues a public statement acknowledging the systemic nature of the problem and committing to specific changes, I would be happy to express my satisfaction with that response. Patricia nodded eagerly. I'll communicate that immediately. As she stepped away to make the call, Dominic received a text from Senator Richardson. Justice comes in many forms. Today it came with wings. Well done. Dominic smiled slightly as he typed his response. This is just the beginning. What had started with a designer handbag on a first-class seat had escalated into a corporate earthquake that would reshape an entire industry. And the aftershocks were just beginning to be felt. 2 hours after Dominic Taylor was removed from Atlantic Airways Flight 372, the ripple effects had become a tsunami. Every Atlantic Airways aircraft across the United States sat immobilized on tarmacs and at gates. The company's entire fleet, grounded by an unprecedented FAA order for an immediate safety compliance review. In reality, the grounding had nothing to do with mechanical safety and everything to do with the swift action of Senator Anthony Richardson, who had presented the FAA with evidence of a pattern of discriminatory incidents on Atlantic Airways flights. The temporary grounding order, officially for Operational Procedure Review, gave the agency a legal basis for immediate action. The economic impact was staggering. With over 200 flights grounded nationwide, more than 30,000 passengers were stranded. Competing airlines scrambled to accommodate travelers with urgent needs, but most affected passengers faced significant delays or cancellations. Hotels near major airports quickly filled with stranded travelers. The estimated cost to Atlantic Airways was climbing by millions every hour. In the company's New York headquarters, CEO Robert Harrison had convened an emergency board meeting. The sleek conference room, usually a place of measured corporate discussion, now resembled a war room in crisis. Our stock has dropped 23% since market open, the CFO reported grimly. We've lost over $1.2 billion in market capitalization in 3 hours. The public relations damage is severe and worsening, added the VP of Communications. The hashtag Atlantic Airways racism has been used over 6 million times. Major influencers and celebrities are sharing the story. Traditional media has picked it up across all networks. Harrison rubbed his temples. What about the passenger? What's Taylor's endgame here? The chief legal officer cleared her throat. Sir, we've just been served with a discrimination lawsuit. The complaint alleges violations of federal aviation regulations, civil rights statutes, breach of contract, and emotional distress. But there's more. They've identified 7 similar incidents in the past year alone and are seeking class action status. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. How did they compile this evidence so quickly? Harrison asked. They didn't need to, the CLO replied. They've been tracking these incidents all along. Taylor's foundation has been funding research into discrimination in commercial transportation for years. Today's incident just gave them the perfect high-profile case to bring it all to light. Harrison's phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Armstrong. Taylor will help end grounding if we issue public statement acknowledging systemic discrimination and commit to specific changes. As the board meeting continued in New York, the story spread across every media platform. Victoria Washington, Dominic's chief legal counsel, gave a measured but powerful statement to the press. What happened to Mr. Taylor today happens to countless travelers of color who don't have his resources or platform. This lawsuit seeks to address not just one incident, but a pattern of discriminatory treatment that has gone unchallenged for too long. Meanwhile, social media had identified Karen Wilson. Her employer, a luxury retail brand sensitive to public opinion, was trending for all the wrong reasons. Their social media team scrambled to distance the company from her actions. In a breaking news segment, Dr. Aisha Johnson appeared via video link from the grounded aircraft. I witnessed the entire incident, she told the national audience. Mr. Taylor was nothing but polite and professional. He simply requested to sit in his assigned seat. The woman had placed her designer handbag there and refused to move it. When he insisted on his rightful seat, airline staff treated him as the problem rather than enforcing their own seating policies. The news anchor followed up. "Dr. Johnson, in your opinion, was this discrimination?" "Without question," she replied firmly. "I've experienced similar treatment myself as a black professional woman. The assumption that we don't belong in certain spaces, like first class, is something many of us face regularly. The difference today is that they chose the wrong person to discriminate against." As this interview aired, journalists began digging into Dominic Taylor's background. What they found only strengthened his position: consistent philanthropy supporting racial justice causes, a technology company with exemplary diversity practices, and a personal history of overcoming systemic barriers through education and innovation. Inside Atlantic Airways, employees watched the unfolding disaster with mixed emotions. Many had witnessed or participated in similar incidents, but had considered them standard procedure rather than discrimination. Now, with the company's practices exposed on a national stage, internal discussion forums filled with anxious questions about liability and job security. Brittany Coleman, the flight attendant who had first suggested Dominic take a seat in economy, made a decision that would further shake the company. She anonymously contacted a journalist with internal emails showing that flight attendants were unofficially encouraged to prioritize the comfort of high-value passengers, a designation that, in practice, rarely included people of color, regardless of their ticket class or status. "We were never explicitly told to discriminate," her message read. "But we understood that keeping certain passengers happy was more important than strictly enforcing the rules. Over time, you internalize whose complaints matter and whose don't." As this new leak hit the news cycle, researchers uncovered Karen Wilson's history of similar incidents at restaurants, hotels, and retail establishments. Social media users unearthed videos of her demanding preferential treatment and complaining about staff who didn't accommodate her demands. Captain Benjamin Walsh, who had authorized Dominic's removal without properly investigating the situation, now faced an internal investigation for failure to follow proper protocols. His decision had exposed the airline to massive liability and public backlash. Atlantic Airways' historical discrimination complaints were now being examined by investigative journalists, who discovered dozens of similar incidents that had been quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements over the years. This pattern of behavior, now exposed, transformed what might have been an isolated PR problem into an existential crisis for the company. Dominic, having returned to his downtown Chicago office, received calls of support from other black executives and civil rights leaders. Many shared their own stories of discrimination in commercial travel, reinforcing his determination to push for systemic change rather than a personal settlement. "They think this is about money," he told his executive team as they gathered in the conference room. "They don't understand that some things can't be bought off." Meanwhile, Senator Richardson announced formal hearings into discrimination practices across the airline industry. "What happened to Mr. Taylor is not an isolated incident," he stated from the steps of the Capitol. "It's representative of a pattern that affects countless travelers who don't have his platform or resources. These hearings will examine how pervasive these practices are and what regulatory changes may be needed to ensure equal treatment for all passengers." Back on the grounded Flight 372, passengers had turned their frustration toward Karen Wilson. The woman who had smugly claimed a seat that wasn't hers now sat uncomfortably as strangers glared and whispered. Her husband William had moved to a seat several rows away, embarrassed by his association with the incident. "Do you realize what you've done?" a businessman across the aisle asked her directly. "You've grounded an entire airline because you couldn't be bothered to check your actual seat assignment or move your purse." Karen's face flushed with indignation. "How was I supposed to know he was some important CEO? He didn't look like he belonged in first class." The comment, overheard by several passengers, only intensified the hostility toward her. One passenger recorded her statement and posted it online, adding fuel to the already raging social media fire. "Have you ever witnessed the powerful consequences when someone with resources stands up against injustice? Comment number 1: if you believe companies should face serious repercussions for enabling discrimination. Would you support an airline that implements meaningful anti-discrimination policies? Or do you think these are just empty corporate promises? Hit like if you're inspired by Dominic's refusal to accept a personal settlement in favor of pushing for systemic change. And what do you think will happen to Karen now that her identity and history of similar behavior have been exposed? Subscribe to find out as this extraordinary story continues to unfold. When Dominic Taylor stepped through the glass doors of NextGen's Chicago headquarters, his executive team was waiting in the lobby. The atmosphere was solemn, yet charged with purpose. This was no longer just about one man's humiliating experience, but about leveraging that moment into meaningful change. Conference room, 5 minutes, Dominic instructed, heading directly to his office. Once alone, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. His mind drifted to a memory from 30 years earlier. His father, Harold Taylor, returning home, with shoulders slumped and eyes filled with quiet dignity after being forced to give up his seat on a cross-country bus despite having a valid ticket. There had been no viral videos then, no powerful allies to call, no legal recourse that a black electrician from the South Side could realistically pursue. "They can take your seat, son," his father had told him that night, "but never let them take your dignity." Dominic had carried those words through Harvard Business School, through the early struggles of building NextGen from nothing, through boardrooms where he was often the only black person present. Now, 3 decades after his father's humiliation, he had transformed a similar experience into a reckoning for an entire industry. The conference room filled quickly with his senior leadership team. Victoria Washington, his chief legal counsel, was updating the group on the lawsuit's progress when her assistant rushed in with a tablet. "You need to see this," the assistant said urgently. The screen displayed leaked internal documents from Atlantic Airways, training materials that instructed staff on handling seating disputes, with language that clearly encouraged preferential treatment for certain passengers over others. While never explicitly mentioning race, the practical application of these policies had resulted in a clear pattern of discrimination. "Where did these come from?" Victoria asked, examining the documents. "They're spreading across social media now," the assistant explained. "Someone inside the company leaked them. The timestamps show they were current as of last month." Dominic reviewed the materials with growing certainty that his experience had been not an anomaly, but standard procedure. This was precisely what made discrimination so insidious in modern America. Policies that seemed neutral on paper, but were applied in ways that reinforced existing biases. Meanwhile, the fallout continued for Karen Wilson. Her husband William had issued a public statement apologizing for his wife's behavior. "I am deeply ashamed of the incident that occurred on Atlantic Airways Flight 372. My wife's actions do not reflect my own values, and I sincerely apologize to Mr. Taylor for the discrimination he experienced." This public disavowal from her own husband created a family rift that became another dimension of the unfolding story. Karen refused to apologize, instead portraying herself as a victim of cancel culture in several tone-deaf social media posts that only fueled public outrage. The incident had sparked intense debate across the country about privilege, accountability, and the real-world consequences of everyday discrimination. Some commentators tried to minimize what had happened, calling it a simple misunderstanding. Others pointed to Atlantic Airways' plummeting stock price as evidence that the market itself would punish discriminatory practices. But beneath these surface discussions, a deeper examination was taking place. Atlantic Airways employees, emboldened by the public attention, began coming forward with stories of institutional racism within the company, from hiring practices to promotion patterns to the unwritten rules of customer service that consistently disadvantaged passengers of color. James Morris and Michael Parker, the gate supervisor and lead flight attendant who had participated in Dominic's removal, were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Both men had followed what they considered standard procedures now exposed as inherently biased. Robert Harrison's attempt at damage control backfired spectacularly. In a hastily arranged press conference, the Atlantic Airways CEO struck a defensive tone. "While we regret the misunderstanding that occurred, Atlantic Airways has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. This isolated incident does not reflect our company values. The characterization of systematic discrimination as a misunderstanding and an isolated incident, directly contradicted by the company's own leaked documents, only intensified public outrage. Dominic prepared for a television interview with respected journalist Rebecca Martinez, known for her incisive questioning and unwillingness to accept corporate talking points. His team advised caution, but Dominic was determined to shift the focus from his personal experience to the systemic issues it revealed. "This isn't about me," he told them. "It's about using this moment to create lasting change." Before the interview, Rebecca's research team uncovered 5 previous incidents where Atlantic Airways had removed passengers of color from flights following complaints from white passengers. In each case, the airline had settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. When the interview aired that evening, Dominic presented not as an angry victim, but as a thoughtful advocate for structural change. "What happened to me happens every day to people who don't have my resources," he explained calmly. "They don't get to ground an airline or file high-profile lawsuits. They simply absorb the humiliation and carry on. That's the real tragedy here. Not what happened to one CEO, but what happens consistently to countless travelers of color who are made to feel they don't belong in certain spaces." Rebecca pressed him on his goals. "Are you seeking financial compensation from Atlantic Airways?" "No," Dominic replied firmly. "Money doesn't solve systemic problems. What I'm seeking is structural change. New training programs, clear anti-discrimination policies, accountability measures, and diversity in leadership. The settlement money should go to organizations fighting transportation discrimination, not to me." The contrast between Dominic's measured systemic focus and Atlantic Airways' defensive damage control approach could not have been starker. Public support for Dominic grew exponentially as his composure highlighted the absurdity of the situation. A billionaire CEO removed from a flight because a woman wouldn't move her designer handbag from his rightfully purchased seat. As the interview concluded, Rebecca asked a final question. "What would you say to the woman who refused to move her bag from your seat?" Dominic paused thoughtfully. "I would thank her," he finally said. Rebecca looked surprised. "Thank her? For having you removed from the flight?" "Yes," Dominic nodded, "because her action, while wrong, has created an opportunity for change that will benefit thousands of travelers who experience similar discrimination without recourse. Sometimes it takes a particularly clear example of injustice to open people's eyes to patterns they've been willing to ignore." The response resonated deeply with viewers. Within hours, Sarkar "Thank you Karen's bag" was trending. A sardonic acknowledgement that her entitlement had inadvertently sparked a national conversation about privilege and accountability. By evening, Atlantic Airways' board of directors had convened to discuss leadership changes. The company's stock had fallen nearly 30%, wiping out billions in shareholder value. Major corporate clients were publicly distancing themselves from the airline. The damage was no longer containable through conventional crisis management. After 6 hours of heated discussion, the board reached a decision. Robert Harrison would step down as CEO. In his place, they would appoint Dr. Maya Johnson, a respected aviation industry executive who had previously led diversity initiatives at a competing airline, making her the first black woman to head a major U.S. carrier. The announcement, made after markets closed, represented more than a personnel change. It was an acknowledgement that the company's culture required fundamental transformation, starting from the top. As news of the leadership change spread, Brittany Coleman made a decision that would further alter the trajectory of events. After witnessing the treatment Dominic had received and recognizing her own role in perpetuating discriminatory practices, she decided to come forward publicly rather than remaining an anonymous source. "I was trained to prioritize certain passengers over others," she admitted in a televised interview. "We never called it discrimination, but the effect was the same. Today, I'm speaking out because I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Her testimony about systematic issues within the airline, from implicit bias in training to unofficial policies that disadvantaged minority passengers, provided critical evidence for both the lawsuit and the upcoming congressional hearings. That night, as Dominic reviewed the day's developments with his team, he received an unexpected call from Dr. Aisha Johnson, the surgeon who had spoken up for him on the flight. "Mr. Taylor, I just wanted to say thank you for turning this horrible experience into a catalyst for change," she said. "As someone who's experienced similar treatment many times without recourse, seeing accountability happen in real time is, well, it's something I never thought I'd witness." "Thank you for speaking up, Dr. Johnson," Dominic replied. "Most people wouldn't have taken that risk." "It wasn't nearly the risk for me that it was for your flight attendant," she noted. "Brittany, Coleman just sacrificed her career to tell the truth." Dominic considered this. "Perhaps we can do something about that." By midnight, plans were forming that would transform not just Atlantic Airways but the standards for the entire industry. What had begun with a designer handbag on a first-class seat was becoming a watershed moment in the ongoing struggle for equal treatment in American life. And the woman who had placed that bag, Karen Wilson, was about to learn that actions born of privilege can have consequences that no amount of money or social standing can prevent. 1 week after the incident that became known across social media as Baggate, Atlantic Airways was a company transformed. Its stock had plummeted 40% from its pre-incident value, wiping out over $2 billion in market capitalization. Cancellations reached record highs as travelers, particularly business travelers and people of color, chose competitors for their journeys. Karen Wilson's life had undergone an equally dramatic transformation. Her husband William had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, but privately telling friends he could no longer be associated with someone whose actions he found morally reprehensible. Her social standing in Chicago's elite circles collapsed as former friends distanced themselves from the toxic publicity. Atlantic Airways' board of directors, faced with an existential crisis, had taken unprecedented steps. They announced sweeping, anti-discrimination initiatives and training programs developed in consultation with civil rights experts. They implemented new protocols for resolving seating disputes that required verification of tickets before any passenger could be removed. Most significantly, they appointed Dr. Maya Johnson as interim CEO, the first Black woman to lead a major American airline. At her first press conference, Dr. Johnson didn't mince words. What happened to Dominic Taylor wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was the predictable result of policies and culture that we must change. Today marks the beginning of that transformation. The airline's former CEO, Robert Harrison, had resigned in disgrace, his golden parachute significantly reduced by the board in response to public pressure. His final official act was to appear before Senator Richardson's Transportation Committee, where he faced blistering questions about the company's history of discrimination. Patricia Armstrong, who had initially tried to manage the crisis with standard corporate damage control, made a different choice. Rather than defending the indefensible, she testified honestly about systemic issues within the airline industry. "The problem isn't just Atlantic Airways," she told the committee. "It's an industry-wide culture that prioritizes certain passengers over others, often along racial lines. We never explicitly wrote down 'treat white passengers better,' but the message was clear in how we trained our staff and which complaints we took seriously." Her candid testimony earned her respect at a moment when most executives were running for cover. It also provided Senator Richardson with ammunition for broader regulatory reforms. Meanwhile, Dominic Taylor had leveraged the attention from the incident to launch a new industry-wide diversity initiative. Rather than focusing solely on Atlantic Airways, he expanded his vision to address discrimination across commercial transportation. "This isn't about punishing one company," he explained at a press conference. "It's about raising standards across an entire industry. Travelers of all backgrounds deserve equal treatment and dignity." Next-Gen Solutions announced a new accessibility technology designed to help airlines better serve diverse passengers, including those with visible and invisible disabilities. The system, already in development before the incident, would help standardize accommodation procedures and reduce the subjective decision-making that often disadvantaged minority travelers. Together with Dr. Aisha Johnson, Dominic established a scholarship for underrepresented students in technology and aviation, creating a pipeline for greater diversity in industry leadership. The airline employees directly involved in Dominic's removal faced different outcomes than many had expected. Rather than being terminated as scapegoats for a systemic problem, James Morris and Michael Parker were required to undergo extensive retraining and to participate in developing new protocols to prevent similar incidents. Firing them wouldn't solve the underlying issues, Dominic explained when questioned about this decision. They were acting according to the culture they were trained in. Real change means transforming that culture, not just punishing individuals. Brittany Coleman, the flight attendant who had come forward to expose discriminatory practices, received an unexpected opportunity. After initially believing her career in aviation was over, she was approached by Dr. Johnson to lead diversity training efforts at Atlantic Airways. Who better to teach about these issues than someone who's been inside the system and chosen to change it, Dr. Johnson explained. Karen Wilson, facing social ostracism and financial pressure from her pending divorce, attempted to rebuild her image through an apology tour that many viewed as insincere. In a widely criticized television interview, she insisted she didn't have a racist bone in her body and was simply trying to save seats for her husband. The interviewer, prepared with footage from the plane and testimony from multiple witnesses, pressed her on the inconsistencies in her story. When confronted with evidence that she had been assigned to row 3, not row 2, Karen became defensive. "I made an honest mistake about the seat numbers. Anyone could have done that. But when Mr. Taylor showed you his valid ticket for seat 2A, you still refused to move your bag," the interviewer pointed out. "I just didn't believe he belonged in first class," Karen replied without thinking, then immediately realized her mistake. The admission of bias, captured on national television, eliminated any remaining public sympathy. Atlantic Airways settled the discrimination lawsuit for an undisclosed amount, with the funds directed to civil rights organizations rather than to Dominic personally. More significantly, the airline committed to major structural changes, including regular civil rights audits, transparent reporting of passenger removal incidents by demographic categories, and financial consequences for executives if discrimination metrics didn't improve. The settlement became a model for the industry, with other airlines rushing to implement similar measures before they became the next target of public outrage. What had begun as one incident on one flight had catalyzed an industry-wide reckoning. Dominic's original destination, the investor meeting in San Francisco, transformed into something much more significant. When he finally made the journey 1 week later, on a competitor airline, the meeting became a platform for announcing a new inclusion-focused venture capital fund that would invest specifically in transportation technologies designed to reduce discrimination and improve accessibility. The investors, impressed by Dominic's handling of the Atlantic Airways incident and recognizing the market potential for inclusive transportation solutions, committed twice the funding he had originally sought. As news of this development spread through business circles, Atlantic Airways competitors began actively courting NextGen for partnership opportunities. The company that had discriminated against Dominic now watched as its rivals benefited from his innovation and influence. 6 months after the incident, Dominic received an invitation that symbolized how much had changed. Dr. Maya Johnson, now the permanent CEO of Atlantic Airways after a successful interim period, invited him to be the first passenger on the inaugural flight of the airline's new service featuring NextGen's accessibility technology that Atlantic had originally rejected, but now embraced as essential to its reformation. The invitation came with a handwritten note: "Seat 2A is reserved for you. No designer bags allowed." Dominic accepted, recognizing the symbolic importance of the moment. What had begun with humiliation would end with transformation, not just for one airline or one passenger, but for an industry that touched millions of lives daily. In her corner office at Atlantic Airways headquarters, Dr. Johnson reviewed the company's latest performance metrics. Passenger satisfaction scores among minority travelers had improved dramatically. Employee reports of witnessing discrimination had decreased by 63%. The culture was changing, slowly but measurably. The industry as a whole was transforming too. Senator Richardson's hearings had resulted in new federal guidelines for passenger removal procedures, requiring documentation of demographic data and justification for all removals. Airlines found to have patterns of discriminatory enforcement faced significant penalties. As the 6-month anniversary of the incident approached, Atlantic Airways stock had recovered half its losses as investors responded positively to the Company's transformation. What had initially seemed like a corporate disaster had become a case study in crisis management and cultural change. The story made an impact far beyond the business world. Law schools used it to teach about corporate liability for discrimination. Business schools created case studies on the financial impact of bias. And social justice organizations pointed to it as an example of how powerful individuals could use their platforms for systemic change rather than personal gain. For Dominic Taylor, the experience reinforced what he had always believed, that true success wasn't measured in wealth or status but in impact. His father's words about dignity had guided him through that moment of humiliation, and now they guided his approach to using the incident for lasting change. 6 months after Baggate first erupted across social media, Dominic Taylor stood in the first-class cabin of an Atlantic Airways Boeing 787, the same model from which he had been removed half a year earlier. But everything else had changed. The flight crew greeting passengers reflected the airline's new commitment to diversity. Captain Raquel Martinez welcomed Dominic personally, acknowledging the significance of his presence. "Mr. Taylor, on behalf of the new Atlantic Airways, welcome aboard. Your seat 2A is ready for you. Bag-free guaranteed." The light moment belied the serious transformation that had occurred. Atlantic Airways had implemented the most comprehensive inclusion training program in the industry, developed in consultation with civil rights experts and informed by the experiences of passengers like Dominic. Every employee, from baggage handlers to the CEO, underwent the training, which went far beyond superficial diversity workshops to address the systemic biases that had permeated the company culture. Dominic's appointment to a newly created Transportation Industry Oversight Committee gave him a formal role in monitoring compliance with anti-discrimination standards across multiple carriers. What had begun as a personal humiliation had evolved into a position of influence over an entire industry. In business schools across the country, the incident had become a case study on the consequences of discrimination. Not just the moral and ethical dimensions, but the tangible business impacts. Atlantic Airways' stock plunge, the fleet-wide grounding, the leadership change, and the subsequent recovery provided a powerful lesson on how quickly customer trust could be lost and how difficult it was to rebuild. Karen Wilson, whose designer handbag had catalyzed the entire sequence of events, had undergone her own transformation. After months of public backlash and the collapse of her social standing, she had begun working community service at a minority youth center as part of what some viewed as a personal redemption journey and others saw as image rehabilitation. The experience of consequences, perhaps for the first time in her life, had forced her to confront her own biases in ways that gentle education never had. Atlantic Airways' new policies had become the industry standard, not through regulatory mandate but through market pressure. Travelers, particularly corporate clients with diverse workforces, began asking pointed questions about airlines' discrimination records and inclusion policies. Companies that couldn't provide satisfactory answers lost valuable business. Dr. Aisha Johnson and Dominic had formalized their partnership, establishing an advocacy group for travelers facing discrimination. The organization provided legal support, documented incidents, and pushed for consistent standards across the transportation sector. What had begun as a chance encounter on a flight had evolved into a powerful alliance for change. Brittany Coleman, once a flight attendant who participated in Dominic's removal, now led the flight attendant union's push for better training and support. Her personal evolution from reluctant participant in discriminatory systems to active change agent embodied the transformation that was possible when individuals acknowledged bias and committed to growth. As the anniversary flight prepared for takeoff, Dominic reflected on the journey, not just the physical journey from Chicago to San Francisco that had been interrupted 6 months ago, but the larger journey toward justice and equality that had been advanced by this incident. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft chime. Dominic secured his belt, smiling slightly at the memory of how differently things had gone the last time he sat in seat 2A. The new flight attendant, a young black woman named Tiana Washington, approached with a genuine smile. "Mr. Taylor, it's an honor to have you aboard today. Everyone at Atlantic knows your story. You changed everything for us." "Sometimes change comes from unexpected places," Dominic replied. 6 months ago, I would never have imagined being back on this airline. Well, we're grateful you are, Tiana said. The old Atlantic wouldn't have hired someone who looks like me for first class. Now our crew reflects our passengers. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Dominic looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. 1 year ago exactly, his father, Harold, had passed away, never living to see his son's technology empire reach its full potential. But his words had lived on, guiding Dominic through that crucial moment when dignity mattered more than accommodation. The flight took off smoothly, climbing into clear blue skies. Once they reached cruising altitude, Dominic took out his phone and composed a text to his father's old number, a ritual he maintained on significant days. Your dignity became my power. The true transformation wasn't just in Atlantic Airways, policies, or leadership. It wasn't even in the industry standards that had been elevated. The real change was in the thousands of travelers of color who would never know what it was like to be removed from a flight because someone didn't think they belonged. They would never experience that particular humiliation because Dominic Taylor had leveraged his position to ensure it wouldn't happen again. 1 year after the incident, statistical analysis showed dramatic improvement in passenger treatment across airlines. Removals for disruptive behavior, often a pretext for discriminatory enforcement, had decreased by 47%. Complaints about discriminatory treatment had declined similarly. The data told a story of real, measurable change. On the anniversary of the incident, Atlantic Airways held a company-wide event to reflect on the lessons learned and recommit to the journey ahead. Dr. Maya Johnson, now firmly established as CEO, addressed employees frankly. 1 year ago, we faced a choice between defending discriminatory practices or transforming our culture. We initially made the wrong choice, and it nearly destroyed this company. Our recovery began when we stopped denying the problem and started fixing it. The event wasn't celebratory. Discrimination hadn't been solved in a year, but it was hopeful. The airline that had once epitomized the problem was now leading the solution, proving that corporate culture could change when properly motivated and guided. For Dominic, the incident had reinforced his commitment to using his platform for systemic change. Next-gen's accessibility technologies were now deployed across multiple airlines, making travel more equitable for passengers with various needs. The venture capital fund he had launched in the aftermath continued to invest in innovations that removed barriers to full participation in public spaces. As his flight landed in San Francisco, Dominic was met by a group of young tech entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds, beneficiaries of the scholarship program he and Dr. Johnson had established. They were the future of the industry, the generation that would build on the changes his generation had fought for. Mr. Taylor, one young woman said as she shook his hand, we studied your case in my business ethics class. Thank you for showing us that standing up for what's right can actually change systems, not just individuals. Dominic smiled, recognizing in her the same determination he had felt as a young entrepreneur facing barriers that seemed insurmountable. The designer handbag that changed an industry, he quipped. More like the man who wouldn't let injustice stand, she replied. And that was the legacy of Seat 2A, not just one man's refusal to accept discrimination, but an entire industry's recognition that change was both necessary and possible. What had begun with humiliation had ended with transformation, turning a moment of injustice into a movement for lasting change. What experience have you had with discrimination or witnessing someone stand up against injustice? Has this story inspired you to use your own voice when you see something wrong? Comment below with your thoughts on how one person's actions can create lasting change. Like this video if you believe in the power of standing firm in your dignity. Subscribe to hear more stories of justice prevailing. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that systems can change when brave individuals refuse to accept the status quo. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a moment that transformed an industry. And remember, sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is simply standing your ground. This story illustrates several powerful truths about discrimination and justice in modern America. First, it demonstrates how privilege often operates invisibly until challenged. Karen Wilson never questioned her assumption that she could occupy space not assigned to her, while questioning Dominic's right to his legitimate seat. Second, it reveals how systems perpetuate discrimination through unwritten rules and implicit biases. Atlantic Airways staff didn't need explicit racist policies. Their culture had trained them to prioritize certain passengers' comfort over others' rights. Third, it shows the transformative power of accountability. When discrimination carries real consequences, financial, reputational, and structural, organizations have powerful incentives to change. Fourth, it highlights how individual dignity can become collective power. By refusing to accept discrimination as just how things are, Dominic created ripple effects that benefited countless others who lacked his resources. Finally, it reminds us that meaningful change requires both pressure and partnership. The external pressure of lawsuits and public outrage created the opportunity, but the collaborative work of developing new policies and training programs sustained the transformation. True justice isn't just about punishment, but about creating systems that prevent harm in the first place.